Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this hybrid event with some of us here in person in that room at the Elliott School for International Affairs, GW, and many online in different parts of Europe. So thank you for joining us for this opening roundtable that is opening the exhibition we have on the second floor about labor, exhaustion, and success company town in the Donbas. And we are doing that at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies in partnership with the University of Alberta, Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and many of the colleagues I will be just presenting now are the way to kind of celebrate the industrial legacy of the Donbas region that, no need to tell you, is now going through a very hard time. And so I think realizing the level of destruction happening in Ukraine now has kind of given new reason for many scholars and activists to look at urban legacy, and not only industrial legacy, but globally kind of urban architecture and what we can do to preserve things from destruction, and how we will have to rebuild and reinvent part of this urban legacy when the war will be over. We will be also showing the Euro Donbas film in a few days. If you are interested to follow that, that is also telling us a lot about the role that foreign firms played in building the Donbas industrial legacy. And here also you have a very important memory war happening about identifying who built the industrial legacy of the Donbas, knowing that Russia has its own version of it. And so the film will be also showing the role, the way how Donbas was embedded into the European industrial fabric. So today we will be discussing what is happening and how do we deal with industrial legacy reconstruction, how we want to discuss that. And we have a great group of colleagues. Let me briefly introduce them. So we have here with us Sofia Dyak, who is the director of the Center for Urban History in Lviv, Ukraine, and who has been a key person in creating this exhibition. She will be telling us a lot about what the center has been doing for this exhibition, but also more globally. And then online, we have Volodymyr Kulikov, who is a visiting professor at the University of Texas at Austin and a former Petrarch Fellow here with us at the Institute. And it was during his time here that with Volodymyr, we had this idea of bringing the exhibition here. And then in the room, we have two of our colleagues, two in the room, two are online. I will be very briefly presenting them. Victoria Donovan from the University of St. Andrews in the UK, who has initiated and led several projects with artists and researchers from Donbas. Iryna Sklokina, Center for Urban History in Lviv, who has been working very closely with local historian and heritage expert in Donbas. We have here Stephen Crowley from Oberlin College, who has studied the region through his fieldwork in coal mine communities and has been one of the main experts on this kind of the Soviet industrial legacy. And online, Sophie Lambroschini from the Center Marc Bloch in Berlin, who is investigating connection between people and infrastructure in wartime through the everyday work of utilities providing vital services in dangerous conditions. So we'll be able to give you a kind of broad overview on how we are thinking about industrial legacy and reconstruction. But before that, I will first give the floor to Sofia for a brief presentation. Yes.
Thank you, Marlene, so much for this introduction, and thank you for the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies here for this invitation and the whole idea of Roundtable and exhibit, and for the Arabs for National Affairs for hosting it, and for all of you coming here on the election days. It's a special day today. In my brief introduction, I would like to situate the exhibit that is on into two concepts. One is institution, the Center for Urban History, okay, but it was curated and created by two colleagues, historians who are joining us today. There's both online, Iryna and Volodymyr Kulikov. And to create the exhibition in how it actually developed. So it looks like a poster exhibition, but there was a journey behind it. So a few words about the institution. The center is located, as Marlene said, in Lviv, which is a city which is in the western part of Ukraine, and from Donbas, it's depending on which city or town, it's 1,000 kilometers plus. It's also a city which was part of several states over the last 100 years. And if you think about heritage on topics, it's actually what one used in traditionally thinks about heritage. It's old buildings in the center, it is listed as World UNESCO Heritage List. It's something that we try to challenge in the way we think about heritage and how it can expand. So the city is where we work is also very important for Polish Jewish history and heritage. While some topics are difficult to discuss, and it is important, and this is what we try to contribute in our programs. The center was established in 2004, almost 20 years soon, and developed an institution which has several programs, offices. So one of them is research, different aspects of urban life and their history that often relevant to the present. Also programs in digital archiving, and here I will mention our urban media archive, which is crucial in developing this institution and public projects after that it was created. So, and in digital history, we do have an online platform called Really Interactive, focusing on city and digital encyclopedia and digital tools and how they can help us explore the past and the legacies and traces. Another area is educational. Currently, we are working. There are online courses that we are offering, but also offline courses in cooperation with universities, but also informally without institutional, without credits, you would say that. And we can develop online resources. You could imagine once you have an archive, digital archive, something that you use in the classroom, and this is something that we are currently working on. So I put some booklets on the ground so that I won't dwell much on what we do. Again, please take and have a look. And then finally, public history. Okay, I think sure. So, see, I mean, it's just here. Okay, so here it's, yeah, if it's better. So hello from a new place, but still the same room. And then finally, public history, and this exhibition is one of the formats of public history. It's a poster exhibition. We do exhibitions indoor. We also sometimes engage in urban public spaces, which is more challenging and more responsible task. But each public history project is a question of responsibility, sensitivity, and awareness of what you do. So the story behind this exhibition, it actually goes to 2013. And then I was thinking about 2013, it's like the year before so many things. It was somewhere in summer that Volodymyr Kulikov, I think it's summer, but you have to check it more properly, came and we had a conversation in our library saying that he was then teaching at Kharkiv University and saying that there is an idea of doing a project related to his key theme about industrial developments and corporate towns in southern parts of Russian Empire. And so that actually resulted in a cooperative project called Industrialization and Urban Landscape of Industrial South of Russian Empire. It was mainly about searching for and digitizing images with industrial elements against urban landscape. So that during 13, Volodymyr traveled to many places and towns.
And it's after and collecting and contacting with museums and digitizing these materials. And as of 2014, some of the places like Donetsk, Luhansk, but also Orlika, Yanakievo, where traveling was not possible. Communication, yes, but traveling not anymore. And so many people were also displaced. So what was digitized was made available in Urban Media Archive. But then, also after 2014, it was also not only a question of traveling on access. And after the area of Donbas came under control of Russia, in a way, there were many people displaced, finding new places all over Ukraine. And one of the places where they were, it was Lviv, not the biggest, but still. And that was for us important to start conversation, how we talk about Donbas, with whom we talk about Donbas. So what do we want? So we decided to bring the stories about Donbas and its history to the downtown of Lviv. So this is the very UNESCO heritage square in front of the city hall, the site of the power, which you sometimes have to take and use that to people go across that. And so that was a poster exhibit. So we focused on industrial via stories of labor and exhaustion of human body and of the body of nature. Together with a series of discussions, we tried to introduce, nuance, challenge some of the assumptions, and also to connect, people in the audience, people speaking. After all, industrial labor is not only about Donbas. It's also about Lviv, maybe not that visible, but it's all about all modern cities. So our conversation started in Lviv in 2015 and followed in following years in places where this exhibition was traveling. So it was on display in Kramatorsk, in Severodonetsk, in Lysychansk, in Pokrovsk, in Drushkivka, and Konstantinivka. So all of the places that we now have and we follow the front line of this year, of this month. Yet our gaze remained from outside and from the center. Many images that you will see in this exhibition actually were made by professionals and outside of Donbas. Many were from archive in Kyiv, because it's very handy to use images which are already digitized, stored, and you can just access them. So in some way, it was a project of empowerment, working with materials from a somewhat colonizing gaze. And we can, you can apply that if that angle will help. So this is actually how we kept searching and developed a project based on this, on the archive, on our practice of archiving and thinking about archive critically and archiving as not only an act of showing, but also an act of critical introspection of what you do, a practice of collecting and representation. So this is how came on archiving post-industry, which in cooperation with St. Andrews University and Victoria Donovan, which was led by Iryna Sklokina. And more importantly, it was in cooperation with Mariupol Local History Museum, Pokrovsk History Museum, and Donetsk Regional Museum of Local History in Kramatorsk. So local perspectives, materials from local museums and private collections, and actually collections which are not thought as collections, we're just laying around in a house or home and apartment, were in focus. And digitizing materials was a part of making them visible, but also challenging how we conceptualize heritage, thinking about, heritage is not only what we are proud of, but also what makes community. And with the full-scale invasion of Russia, what was digitized meant what, or maybe meant what was saved. Because we do not know exactly what is destroyed or is lost, especially when we think not about museums, but private collections or private holdings. And people, when evacuate or leave, they don't take big boxes of photographs. They take some, but not really all. So at the Roundtable, I hope we will develop this thing more. Collections can be found on our Urban Media Archive. And we are also in the moment, in the place where we are finding the ways to talk about what these materials mean, what is loss, what is displacement, and how we go through this war. And this exhibition, which made it here, and this table is one of the places of doing that. So thank you for hosting. Yeah.
Thank you, Sophia, so much. I propose we now give the floor to Victoria to launch our discussion, go over our 4 presentation, and then we will have time for the Q&A, and Sophia will be managing the Q&A coming from here, and Volodymyr, the Q&A who will be coming from the online room. So let's begin with Victoria.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Marlene. Yes. That's right. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Marlene, and thank you to your wonderful team for the help putting together this event. I'm honoured to be included in the company of some of the most knowledgeable researchers of Donbas at this event today, and delighted to be working again with Iryna, Volodymyr, and Sofia, whose research has radically expanded our knowledge and understanding of the industrial history and heritage of the Ukrainian East and its meaning in the broader context of Ukraine's past, present, and as we'll discuss today, post-war future. Today I've been asked to talk about our activism in Donbas after 2014 and what lessons this can offer for thinking about the post-war reconstruction of Donbas after the liberation of the territories from Russian occupation. Between 2019 and 2021, I had the opportunity to travel widely in Donbas while conducting research for my forthcoming book. During my visits, I met a number of dynamic activist communities carrying out work in different cities and settlements of the region to counter toxic Russian world propaganda and promote an alternative, free-thinking and civic-minded vision for their region. These communities had not emerged in a void. They were a result of a confluence of factors, the most important of which perhaps is what Emily Channell Justice has referred to as the withdrawal of the state. In her recent book, Emily Channell Justice argues that the neoliberalization of the Ukrainian economy after socialism resulted in state withdrawal from many of its traditional responsibilities and the displacement of these responsibilities onto other actors such as NGOs, charities, and volunteers. The growing emphasis on individual autonomy and self-sufficiency, she suggests, was internalized during and after the Maidan revolution, when citizens became more aware of the power of self-organization to manifest change in their society. The joint condition of state withdrawal and growing civic confidence in the power of self-organization was surely the foundation stone for the dynamic activist culture that I encountered in the Ukrainian East. But 2 additional spurs also existed for activism in Donbas. Firstly, the proximity of hybrid war that divided the region after 2014 as a result of Russian-backed military intervention and brought with it the existential threat of military and ecological destruction. And second, the concentrated presence of state and Western funding in the region, resulting from a strategic effort to stimulate cultural resistance to Russian domination. Just changing the view of the PowerPoint on the slide for a moment. Okay, that seems to be showing as it should now. In interviews and conversations that I conducted with Donbas cultural activists before the escalation of the war, a recurring theme was the region's perceived institutional crisis. Dmytro Cheperny, a curator at the arts organization Iryna, displaced from Donetsk in 2014, for example, spoke in interview about the relative absence of institutions in the Ukrainian East, as well as a lack of institutionalized curatorial practices, something that he thought had resulted in local cultural initiatives lacking substance and sustainability. Oleksandr Kuchynskyi, a digital artist from Severodonetsk, echoed this opinion, arguing that there were no viable cultural institutions in his city where creative communities could gather and exchange ideas. and that the only option available to young people was to take to the street. While some activists did engage institutions, for example, local history museums, this kind of engagement was always critical and designed to initiate a conversation around institutional restructuring. Faced with a landscape of perceived institutional, oh, I can't move the slide now. Okay. Instead of the keyboard. Right. Faced with a landscape of perceived institutional inadequacy, many activists turned to self-organization to address what they considered to be the most urgent questions facing their communities. These questions included deindustrialization and the management of industrial heritage preservation. And on this slide, you can see some images from grassroots initiatives in Severodonetsk to preserve industrial objects which had been collected from derelict factories and warehouses and had been discarded by official institutions as historical trash, to quote one activist. They also included maintaining dialogue and exchange with younger generations in the occupied territories. And on this slide, you can see a self-organized initiative in Lysychansk, which was authored by Vitaly Matukhna, an activist from the region, which was intended to bring together artists from both sides of the militarized border to contribute to exhibitions of local creativity that showed an alternative vision of the industrialized regions to the exoticizing ones that are sometimes produced outside of Donbas. Let's get back to the slide. As Katerina Yakovlenko has argued, these processes together amounted to the formation of an alternative institutionality in the region. Rather than wait around for the state to formulate an adequate response to matters of increasing urgency, activists mobilized to articulate these responses themselves. This kind of self-reliance, which Daria Cymbaluk and I have written about in our recent book as Делать нечего practice, or nothing else for it practice, presents a model of civic action that should be taken seriously in discussions about post-war reconstruction. And in the remaining time that I have, I want to just offer some examples of this kind of practice from Mariupol, which many in Ukraine believe to be one of the most dynamic hubs of activism in Ukraine before the escalation of the war and the occupation of the city, before turning to reflect on how these practices might inform approaches to cultural policymaking after the war. When I visited Mariupol in November 2021, I met with members of Platforma Chu, an arts activist organization working with teenagers from marginalized groups, and especially LGBTQ+ teenagers. I'd been following Chu's activities online for some time and was impressed with the grassroots work that they'd done, raising civic consciousness and building confidence and creative forms of self-expression among younger generations of Mariupol residents. As Masha Pronina, an artist and mentor at Chu, explained, the community had emerged in response to the patriarchal culture that still dominated local cultural institutions and was intended to provide a space for young people who felt alienated and excluded within their communities. Supported by the Ukrainian state and external funders, Chu ran an extremely successful series of workshops with young people, supporting them in the development of basic skills such as public speaking, designing protest posters that could go viral online, and writing letters of petition about the issues that mattered most to them to local politicians. They also helped young people develop skills in the creative industries, including DJing, podcast recording, and exhibition curation. When I visited their premises, works from a collaboratively curated exhibition on themes of loneliness and life beyond the factory were on display on the walls. You can see some of these works on the slide. Also in Mariupol, I had the chance to talk to Sashko Prochuk, a key figure in the Free Filmers NGO, a filmmaking collective who make documentary cinema about aspects of life in the Ukrainian East that don't normally make it onto the big screen. These include working class, queer, and neurodiverse culture. Like Chu, I'd been following the Free Filmers' work for some time and teaching some of the films that they made to my students in Scotland. And I was excited to meet the makers of these works. While we walked around Mariupol's left bank, Sashko talked about the collaborative methods that underpinned the group's filmmaking, the ways that they produced work in partnership with local people who they showed on screen to avoid exploitative, exoticizing visions of these communities. He also talked about the radical egalitarianism that formed the basis of Free Filmers' activity, the way they tried to resist hierarchical structures that reinforce privilege, in the ways that individuals were presented on their website, as you see here, to the formulation of the credits at the end of films. Both of these organizations were involved not just in producing arts and culture, but also actively working to form communities who could sustain a shift in political and social life in years to come. When I interviewed her about her work at CHU following her displacement in March 2022, Masha Pronina explained this shift in the following terms. These amazing LGBTQ+ and not only LGBTQ+ kids, these new kids, this new generation, new Ukrainians, we're so proud of them. We would also always say that this generation will change our country, but the fact that we have kids like this, well, that they're going to make our country strong. It's worth noting that this community building work allowed organizations like CHU and Free Filmers to quickly reorientate their activities following the escalation of the war and the occupation of Mariupol, and to draw on local expertise and networks to begin providing humanitarian aid for those worst affected by the war. Members of CHU, including Masha, are currently working out of Lviv, where they're training mobile brigades to provide art therapy to many displaced and traumatized children flooding into the city. Free Filmers, meanwhile, are working from Zaporizhia with a fleet of drivers to evacuate people from the east and to deliver humanitarian aid, including portable stoves, sleeping bags, medicine, and arts material for children so that they can remain children even in these most extreme circumstances. So finally, what insights do these pre-February 2022 experiences offer for thinking about questions of heritage and culture-led post-war reconstruction in Donbas? Well, I want to make 3 brief points. Firstly, activist communities have already been active in Donbas for over 8 years, addressing questions that will be more important than ever following the liberation of these territories from Russian occupation. These questions include the creative engagement of derelict and ruined spaces, preservation of vulnerable heritage, innovation of initiatives that can assist in the reintegration of young Ukrainians from the occupied territories, and projects that assist inclusivity in socially fractured cultural contexts. Secondly, activist communities have constructed an alternative institutionality, which exists in parallel to state structures and is arguably more dynamic, responsive, and relevant than many of these. This institutionality should be taken seriously and underpinned with state and external funding. What I want to underline, however, is that it's crucial that any external sponsorship of these initiatives is undertaken in a spirit of collaboration and humility. And by that, I mean respect for local activist values and priorities and resistance of hierarchical and sometimes neo-imperial ideas of development and capacity building that position local activists as recipients of knowledge and beneficiaries rather than engaging them in processes of active listening, learning, and collaboration. And finally, the last point I wanted to make is that culture and heritage-led reconstruction is already underway and is being undertaken by these communities at distance. One example of this that I wanted to end with is a project that I've been collaborating on with the Free Filmers Collective from Mariupol to create an archive of multimedia materials memorializing the activist community in Mariupol. These processes don't need to be invented by outsiders. They're happening organically by the communities for whom they matter most. And the challenge for us as outsiders is to work out how best to support them without appropriating these projects and disenfranchising local communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. I think your last point, especially on the need to accompany what is happening on the ground, what is the genuinely grassroots activism, and not trying to appropriate or orient it is really, I think, a key point, and that will be a key question of the reconstruction, right, on one way or another. And I think it's we are discussing it in the case of Ukraine, but that would work for so many countries that has to face reconstruction. And I would like to give the floor to Sophie, who will be online and will be discussing the issue of infrastructure reconstruction and the challenges for international aid projects and how they can be addressing local needs in the provision of critical utilities. So we will kind of continue the discussion that Victoria just launched.
Okay, I had sent some visuals, a short PowerPoint, 3 slides. Could you put them on or?
Sure, no problem.
Thank you. Well, meanwhile, hello everyone, and I'm very happy to be on this panel, and it's rare and very valuable to be able to speak solely on Donbas and focus on Donbas, and I'll pick up actually, I guess in the same spirit as Victoria did. I think you will see it resonating in some ways, the two presentations. So here on the screen, I'll just leave this on for a little bit to give you background. This is a cross-frontline water infrastructure network that I will be beginning the talk with, and then go over to other aspects. But I would like to link my talk about Donbas with what is happening at the moment, the context of I think what we could call Russia's new front that it opened against Ukraine, the electric front, which reaches deep into the fabric actually of Ukrainian society, with Ukraine losing over half of its electric capacity. And so Kiev is particularly vulnerable, as most of you know, and but many other cities too, with millions of people in the dark without heating, no water and toilets. And so every time electricity goes off, people wonder, will it actually switch on again, or are we going to be stuck like this? And so there is a real threat of meant by the Russians in this energy front to push for social collapse. So when light does switch back on, it is a result of blue-collar workers, electricians who weld together torn cables, and trucks and cane drivers and plumbers and heating technicians, and all the people in the back offices of the electricity companies and the water supply companies. So what I would like to say is that actually this front is not did not begin in October. This energy front began in the Donbas region many years ago, in 2014, in the spring of 2014, when the Donbas region experienced the effect of shelling on their power and water network throughout, therefore, the whole first stage of the war. So dozens of workers, the one that just described, were killed or maimed by shelling and mines while trying to repair pipelines or electric lines for about 4 million people living near the front line in Donbas. So the full-scale invasion now obliterated the hardware of the system, which was built during Soviet industrialization. But the expertise of these workers survived and circulates countrywide. So I'll first tell you quickly about how workers operated a water pipeline system under fire during the war in Donbas. I would just like to introduce it with some specificities about what a water and power supply network in Donbas was like. And then finally, I'll conclude with a description of the challenges that such systems and the repairs and reconstruction of systems pose for aid from abroad. So the water and power system in Donbas, so what I focused on is Donetsk Oblast that you can see on the map, with Mariupol at the very bottom, and at the top you can see a squiggly little blue line, which is the Seversky Donetsk, which is a river that is the watershed for the whole region, because the industrial parts of Donbas require a lot of water. It's an industrial conurbation like the Ruhr region in Germany, and densely packed with people and factories. The water supply system developed over decades during the Soviet period and is embedded in the company towns. And it left actually an imprint, and I think this is maybe not obvious to most, it left an imprint on the geography of the land. So you have the lazy Seversky Donetsk River in the north, and the water is pumped into large diameter pipes and canals. These are all visible, and they're part of the Donbas landscape, from Slovyansk down to Mariupol and east to Donetsk and west to Pokrovsk, just as much part of the landscape actually as the famous mining sludge hills that one associates with the region. So this water supply system was a Soviet industrial and some might say absurd feat because the water had to be pumped uphill to get it to the place of main consumption, the Donetsk conurbation, and down to Mariupol, 300 kilometers away. So this means that it needs a lot of electricity to function. So you might have already understood what I'm getting at is that electricity infrastructure systems and water systems are interdependent components, and they rely on a material base, which is an integrated infrastructure network that penetrates deep into the physical geography of a region, from the watershed to electric pumps, to more pumps and into distribution system, but that it also enters into the social system of the region. So a short point on the workers, on the managers, on the consumers also. The water supply network that I'm speaking about, that was managed by a Ukrainian company called Voda Donbasu, was operating across the front line between Kiev-controlled areas and separatist areas with 11,000 employees working on both sides. So both water technicians and electric technicians worked in the dangerous gray zone between the forward positions of the Ukrainian armed forces and the Moscow-backed separatists. So when it comes to the nitty-gritty repairs, the water and electric systems are mechanical, they're not automatized. This is partially also the legacy of the Soviet period. They rely on manpower. They rely on employees remaining in their jobs despite danger. At the Dyak, the Ukraine's largest private energy company, which belongs to Rinat Akhmetov, Ukraine's businessman who is still considered a billionaire, according to recent assessments made by Forbes Ukraine and an investment fund. He also has many of his employees who are on these front lines. So what did I see when I did this field research between 2018 and 22? So first of all, that at Voda Donbasu, there's a strong occupational culture that is built around long-term employment, recruitment, high-level technical training of plumbers and welders as engineers, the benefits of the Soviet social corporate advantages, children's camps, housing, medical care, all this was still functioning during the war, and which actually developed and strengthened further during the war in a way, for instance, through corporate support for families stuck in the war zones. This was the case for both Dyak and for Voda Donbasu. The war shaped invisible occupations into kind of war expertise also, that was exclusive for these types of companies in the Donbass. So it created an occupational specificity of war experience, which was then shared throughout the country over the past month since February. Then there's also another aspect that needs to be taken into account in light of what I will tell you about the reconstruction and aid, is to take into account the important asymmetry in the sector, power and water sectors, but utility sector in general. And actually it's visible to the naked eye. If we go over to the next slide, please. Can someone go, or can I do that myself? Here. So here you see Voda Donbasu is a public company. It belongs to the regional administration of Donetsk Oblast, now based in Kramatorsk. And you can see the workers, they're just wearing the clothes they brought from home. They're wearing leather shoes and go deep into these holes filled with water to make repairs. So this is also the legacy of the post-Soviet period, which Victoria described in detail, when companies like these commons suffered from underinvestment since the end of the Soviet period. with the institutional delegitimization of the state that happened during that period, and the narrative of marketization, but which was not really put into practice, and on the ground in the region, a practical actual warscape of competing economic criminal groups, which came together to let the commons decay. On the other hand, if we go on to the next slide, you can see the here, these are the workers of the company Dyak, and you can see that they're all wearing uniforms with the Dyak symbols on them. And this is a completely different picture because it is a private company that is running a partially privatized energy network. The company has invested and developed and put the stress on integrating European energy markets. So you can see the difference here and there, and this will make a difference when it comes to reconstruction and aid. In both cases, however, we have to say that the Soviet technological base still exists, which means that all the parts, all the equipment that is now being destroyed or has been destroyed requires very specific adaptations. You can't just buy transformers in Europe and then put them into the Ukrainian electricity system right now. And this is a gigantic problem, and it's a gigantic problem because it's a long-term problem. So third point, so what does this mean for international aid in terms of repair and reconstruction? First, aid and reconstruction in the form of, let's say, supplies and spare parts need to take into account the Soviet technological base of infrastructure needs. So it can be in principle modernized, but cannot be always modernized in the midst of emergency and urgency of war. Red tape and bureaucracy need to be lifted as much as possible to accelerate the processes of imports, of recreating supply chains, because they have been destroyed within the country, for instance. Second, infrastructure systems need to be regarded holistically. Repair and reconstruction programs in the future need to consider the whole system, how it fits into the local geography, and cannot take just one small part that might be easier to repair or more accessible. It's what the French Ministry of the Economy and Finance, that was very motivated by the best of intentions, granted a loan of 64 million euros to secure and modernize Mariupol's drinking water back in 2019. But to do that, it cut it off from the whole supply system of Voda Donbasu coming down from the Seversky Donetsk. And so as a result, it destabilized the whole system. So, okay, the consequences were not that visible because as you know, Mariupol has really become the martyr city, and everything was destroyed way before the French could modernize the system. But nevertheless, this has to be said. And finally, one should not forget that there are aspects of this post-Soviet social that benefit to be kept alive, because this occupational solidarity that I spoke about, that has been transforming and strengthening during the war, can be a basis for aid and reconstruction. So just to say that that any aid should consider the legacies in architectural and economic and also in social terms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie, for your analysis and the fieldwork you were able to do. I propose we give the floor now to Iryna, who is also online, to avoid too many shifts with technology. And then after, we will have Stephen here, and we will be able to, and after, open the floor for Q&A. But let's have Iryna now.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I also thanks so much to Sophie, because she was actually speaking about infrastructure, and I would like to turn to a different kind of infrastructure, as I'm historian of heritage and devoted my research to like origins of heritage infrastructure in Donbas. And now we are talking actually about the future and how we are going to build the future based on some kind of previous experiences of dealing also with trauma and dealing with regional specificity. And here I would like maybe to be more critical in our approach to heritage. And I think Victoria Donovan in the beginning, she also showed very interesting examples of contemporary initiatives of alternative approaches to cultural heritage. And I think the spirit of her speech was about localism and empowerment of local initiatives and giving voice to the people themselves. But when we are also thinking critically about this localism and local approaches to heritage, I would like also to highlight how much these local practices of heritage were also very much created and designed in the framework of big ideological projects, and how we should always be very critical about who is empowered and who is speaking when we are dealing with heritage. And here I would like to reflect about the very origin of heritage infrastructure in Donbas. So especially in post-Second World War period, when the big scale of destruction actually forced people to think more about preservation, as everywhere in the world, I think, after the Second World War. And actually here in the Donbas region, it was another wave of industrialization, socialist industrialization, second one after the Second World War. And this development of heritage infrastructure, such as museums and also monuments and heritage sites, was informed by Stalin practices of cult of personality, so-called, and especially cult of local scholars, explorers, and pioneers was very much developed during the Stalin era. And till today, when we are talking about some great like big figures associated with Donbas, we should be very much aware that these figures were very much promoted in the framework of Stalinist authoritarian ideology, and very much xenophobic one, and so many like local figures connected to production and exploration of Donbas as a region was very much connected to this big ideology of Stalin era. And I think it's also quite close to American context. I think this cult of achievements, as you can see here on my slide, achievements of pioneers who developed and founded first coal mines in the region and other enterprises. I think it's also very much instrumentalized in the big ideological narratives. So of course it's a matter of a local pride, but also very much a part of kind of statist accounts, state-centered patriotic kind of narrations of the past. And we can also talk about other experiences and infrastructures of institutions dealing with culture and heritage. And for example, here I love this case very much. It is an art studio and workers art gallery in a very small company town in Donbas and Druzhkivka, which exists till today. Now it's rather a museum than an art studio. But very interestingly, that even under Soviet regime, it was still possible to develop quite a grassroots initiatives where industry and production met with cultural practices, and these huge resources developed by or like provided by industry were sent to cultural initiatives. And I think this is also a part of this cultural infrastructure today, that we still have so many institutions institutions which were very closely tied to industrial enterprises, and also this local activity of some figures who actually came from workers' background. And I think it's also something very valuable when we are thinking about heritage in the Donbas in the future, that we should not present culture as an opposition to purely industrial character of the cities. So we should understand that industrial production and cultural practices are very, very closely intertwined. But of course, even after the Soviet period, this network or infrastructure, such as museums and other institutions, were very much instrumentalized once again for this self-aggrandizing, glorifying strategies, especially of the local elites, which were very much criticized, of course, for their kind of extraction approach to Donbas and to its ecology and natural resources. And here you can see examples from the local museums of how like their exhibitions also very much were focused on glorifying like local economic elites. But also Ukrainian state and its approaches to the Donbas and its cultural institutions, I think very often it was also very much appropriation and exploitation. And here you can see one example of how the exhibition of Company Museum was, so to say, Ukrainianized, so put into national Ukrainian narrative, where you can see how actually this is a chemical enterprise producing fertilizers for the soil. And here you can see like Ukrainian grain as a symbol of like Ukrainian national identity, which perfectly, of course, fit together when we see like fertilizer and Ukrainian grain. And like another example of how like national narratives appropriate different parts of local past. Here I show you the case of monument to Kozak Drushko, so actually commemorating a mythical figure from 17th century. And in a very interesting way, this figure is both very much present in Ukrainian national narrative and in Russian rather kind of imperialist narrative. And actually this monument was founded by a local pro-Russian oligarch, but very much also beloved by like Ukrainian patriotic civic activists in the city. So, and it also shows you how the same symbol can be not only contested, but also somehow reinterpreted, but once again in very extractive and very much kind of way where you cannot see the local empowerment. And also the struggle against everything communist and socialist in Ukraine today, and this process called decommunization, which opens also some opportunities. For example, here you can see how in this case of this museum in Kramatorsk, for example, they put forward some female histories of male labor heroes from the socialist period, because of this shift away from glorifying like big political figures from the socialist past to more kind of local figures. And sometimes you, for example, get more chances to make heritage more diverse, for example, through kind of putting female figures forward, or some other aspects which were previously forgotten. And once again, about this localism and appropriation, I think it's also very obvious in case of monuments, which became local founding myths, but also very much appropriated and taken by this big socialist or communist narrative, which is the case of Ordzhonikidze, who is both the founder of a local enterprise, but also biggest Stalin friend and kind of Stalin's accomplice. And so just after this kind of brief description of the past experiences and infrastructures of heritage in the Donbas, I would like to just once again to ask this question when we are talking about the future and future role of heritage in reconstruction of the Donbas after the ongoing war. I think we should also be very critical about these aspects of whose heritage is and who actually has the right for heritage, and if we are gonna once again instrumentalize and appropriate the heritage of local communities, or we have some other options for this heritage. Of course, you can also see from what I showed that there is a very big kind of opportunity and challenge of rethinking previous heritage practices and different components of canon of cultural heritage of this region. And I think this is also like the biggest challenge for us, not to overestimate the role of heritage and not to make it a self-aggrandizing element of identity, and not to make it once again the element of propaganda, but of course to think of heritage more critically as an opportunity to be kind of self-reflective, and also self-reflective about our own past, regional past, and also national past. And I think actually it's a challenge for us all not to once again appropriate heritage or instrumentalize it in bringing some new values or promotion of some kind of positive narratives for the region, but also always be aware about what local is and what national is in every case when we are dealing with heritage. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Iryna. I think it was a really important discussion, and the kind of memory war aspect of heritage appropriation is really something that will become, probably given the context, even more important. And so now let's give the floor back here in the room to Stephen, who will be, I guess, knowing what he has been working on, will be also speaking about the regional identity and kind of contested historical memory, and how do we integrate that into a post-war reconstruction.
Yeah, so thank you. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to participate in this event. So my own remarks will be fairly broad. It's been some years since I conducted fieldwork in the Donbas. So I'll just add a few thoughts about working class communities there and elsewhere. So for myself, the Donbas first came to my attention, and perhaps for many people from the outside of the region, during the miners' strikes, coal miners' strikes in 1989, 1991. And I think it's worth noting that contrary to expectations, coal miners in the Donbas and elsewhere were not protesting the changes that Gorbachev was bringing about, but they, in their words, they said, we haven't seen perestroika yet. We're trying to bring about perestroika from below. And this became even more evident in 1991 when coal miners in the Donbas were protesting to bring about an end to the Soviet system and independence for Ukraine. And I think this is important to remember because it can run counter to some stereotypes that many of us have, myself included sometimes, about working class communities and the resistance to change. They're clinging to nostalgic views of the past and so on. That's at least not inevitable. So there's nonetheless a substantial pride in labor that defined the Donbas over many years. So very much following on Iryna's comments about heritage. And I think this is particularly the case in coal mining communities. So it may seem a bit incongruous to talk about this now, given the horrible bloodshed that's happening now in this region, to this very day. But coal miners every day risk their lives going to work. And this was something that just resonated through those communities, that at any moment, your loved one might not surface. And this was particularly a problem in the Donbas because it had been mined for so many years that the mines became deeper and deeper, and many were in the process of already being worked out, and particularly dangerous. So this sense of pride so this sense of ever-present sense of danger helped to create a particularly strong sense of community, and not least in the towns and settlements built around a single mine. So these are sometimes referred to as isolated communities that have this strong sense of kind of solidarity, for lack of a better word. So that sense of pride and community can also be found in other so-called monotowns built around other industries. So monotowns are single industry towns, typically built around a city forming enterprise, as they refer to. In other words, the workplace appeared first, the factory, and then you built the social infrastructure, the town or the city around it. So Soviet ideology really helped to foster this sense of pride in one's labor. So we've seen this in Iryna's presentation. I'm thinking about, there's a famous poster from 1921, Donbas, the heart of Russia, just showing how the coal of Russia after the revolution was fueling the industrialization drive throughout the Soviet Union. They had annual days of the Day of the Steelworker and the Day of the Coal Miner that had some real meaning to these people in these communities. I remember a leader of the coal miner strikes in 1991, while he was working to bring about an end to communism, an end to the Soviet Union, but pointing out with pride, very much along the lines of the posters that Iryna showed, a kind of series of pictures depicting the increasing mechanization of coal mining over the years. So coal miners were no longer working with their bare hands and crawling around, but so very much pride in that profession, even though very much working to bring about an end to the Soviet system. So the post-Soviet period, was a difficult one for the Donbas, at least for many people, even before 2014. So while some workplaces thrived under privatization, oligarchic owners could be pretty ruthless. Many mines were closed, and this was especially challenging for these isolated mining communities. Unemployment rose alongside many of the related social ills. Illegal mining contributed to the rise of criminality of the region. And the tensions that resulted certainly didn't cause the violence that erupted in 2014, but they certainly contributed to it. So I think while some of the Donbas industries can be rebuilt in the wake of this brutal war, some will not. Coal mining is not the future. It may be for some time, but it's not the long-term future. Deindustrialization is hard, not least because of the resentment and the resulting politics that it can leave in its wake. And ironically, but also tragically, the war has kind of hastened this process, destroying not only much of the physical infrastructure, but also stable employment alongside it. So one challenge for restructuring will be restoring many of the viable industries and workplaces, and many of those as possible, but another will be transitioning to a more post-industrial future, one that can be both economically and socially viable. I've lived for many years in Cleveland, a city where about 100 years ago, many Ukrainians actually emigrated to work in the steel mills in the city. So Cleveland is part of the so-called Rust Belt. Steel is still made in Cleveland. You can still see the gas flares from downtown there, but they need many fewer workers than they did in the past. So healthcare is now the biggest employer in Cleveland. So the region continues to take pride in its industrial heritage and even trying to make it trendy. So they refer to in Cleveland Rust Belt chic, which is something that people in the Donbas, as Victoria pointed out, may be able to teach people in Cleveland some about as well. So maybe a conversation can happen there. But it's also a community that continues to struggle with the loss of jobs, with poverty, and the politics of resentment. So the challenge isn't simply providing employment, as important that that is, it's also, industrial jobs in the Donbas also led to this sense of pride and created a real sense of community. And reinventing that in the wake of war and deindustrialization won't be easy. But I think as our presenters have pointed out so far, the pride can be found, at least in part, in this industrial heritage of the region and a real sense of regional identity. And community can also be created out of that shared sense of resilience and overcoming hardship. Now that may seem a bit far-fetched, but I have found the sense of community built around resilience in other post-Soviet monotowns, including some where a strong sense of attachment remains despite considerable hardship. So hopefully in the longer run, Donbas can reinvent itself, much as the Ukrainian emigres in Ukraine helped Cleveland to do. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. I think you mentioned also a really important point about what will happen in the future and this kind of disindustrialization transformation. We now have about less than half an hour, like 20 minutes for Q&A. So I would give the floor back to Sofia and then Volodymyr online, and then invite you to ask a question. We may have also a question online, but we have questions here. Yeah. So we have questions in the room. Let's take them. There will be a mic circulating. We ask you to wait for the mic so people who are online can hear you also. And Sophia, you can go back.
Yeah, so please ask your question. We will probably do this part.
So Oleksandr Kuchynskyi, I'm assistant professor at the Kyiv School of Economics, but actually here I'm a Bedrock fellow for once. So first of all, thank you very much for raising these important questions and for putting really brilliant platform and discussion and people to discuss it. My questions are, I think, most to Victoria, but maybe Stephen, but please also the rest of the speakers will feel free to also jump in. We heard a lot about the industrialization, about the heritage of Donbas, the industrial heritage, and that there has to be renewal. So my question is, do you get any impression from your field work? Where is this renewal going to be? What are the maybe possibilities and or internal resources where you see where this can be happening? My first question. My second question is, I actually happen to have been doing research in Kramatorsk, Druzhkivka, and Konstantinivka in 2018, and it was on collaborative practices in countering corruption in education. And it was amazing. There was an NGO, Nova Druzhkivka, that was everything what you described, Victoria, like art, youth, anti-corruption, like everything there. So maybe you could reflect where do you see and plus recently we've also done study on local authorities and on their attitudes to collaboration with civil society. It was already during the war, and it was amazing that they are even more open than they used to be last year. So question is, do you see there the possibility that your thesis, this avoiding disenfranchisement and appropriation, could be through strengthening these collaborative practices between authorities and the amazing civil society that we have described? So thank you very much.
Maybe there's one more question. We got two, and then we'll just
Hi, my name is Amy Chen. I work at Freedom House, also here with my colleague. I wanted to ask, we're asking questions about, who leads this process about cultural heritage. We're talking about how it should be centered on locals. With the war and so many people who are displaced, can you talk, any of you, talk a little bit about those dynamics, about who is there as a local versus locals who have left and but still have a stake, and whose voice should be heard? So directed to any of you, but I hope that Sophie can speak to that. I tried to go to the Center for Urban History a couple of weeks ago when I was in the booth, but I know it's closed. So.
Yeah, that's actually developing.
Thank you, Roman Kalachak, business scholar here, and I'm from Lviv, University. And my first remark when we're talking about Donbas, it could be quite specific. What we're talking about boundaries. This is East, this is Donetsk, Luhansk region, this is Donetsk, Mariupol. So we would be quite careful when we trying to define these borders when we're talking about in general about this region. Yes, it's my first remark. We all shared our experience with cooperating with Donbas. I was involved in several projects. One of this is called Rebuilding European Studies in post-conflict affected areas, but we include, for example, University of Mariupol, so Lyansk, but Lyansk, Melitopol, for example, yes, for now all under occupation. And what is important is when we're talking about Donbas, I'm very skeptical about some kind of regional identities, promoting some kind of regional identities, or rebuilding it in general, or integrating this region when we're talking, because it should happen in the Ukrainian context, yes? To disproportionate attention only for some specificities without taking general Ukrainian context would be why undermine all other efforts. Thank you. It's endless discussion. A lot of time, but just the remarks.
So let's then ask for three. So Victoria, go ahead. I think some of the I think it's nice. Let's go and pick up each part.
And I feel like I'm going to take the mic first. So maybe we should offer it to one of the people online, but maybe I'll say it since you asked. So thank you very much for these questions. I was hoping somebody would ask about the definition of Donbas, because that was the part of the talk I had to cut out, and as you can see, it was already a bit long. But I think that's very important, and the paragraph that I cut from the beginning of the talk was about the problematic resonances of the term Donbas. And you know, this has already been pointed out by scholars from the region already in 2014, but most recently, Ukrainian decolonial scholars such as Asya Batyeva and Elliott pointed out that this term, which actually is a shortening of the Donetsk coal basin, is problematic because it reduces the region to its mineral composition, and therefore is a structural violence that Asya Batyeva has talked about as the resourcification of the Ukrainian East, and Daria talks about as the fossil fuelization of the Ukrainian East. So Donbas is much more than its industrial history and heritage, though that's been a focus of today's presentations. Also, Iryna, a literary scholar, has talked about the difficult resonances of the term Donbas because it was so enthusiastically appropriated by Russian-backed fighting groups after 2014. And so this means that it has toxified the toponym for many people in Ukraine today. But Iryna and I both wrote in the introduction to our edited collection, Donbas Imaginaries, about the fact that this term still resonates in different ways for different generations, different socioeconomic groups, in some cases positively, and that really varies across different parts of the region of the East. And so using that term, I wanted to point out, as I use it in full kind of awareness of these sort of nuances and the difficulties, because it is a really important part of the discussion, so thank you for bringing that up. So maybe just I'll speak to your question and then I'll hand it over to somebody else. So where is the renewal going to happen? I asked that question in a talk recently in St Andrews, where we had a member of parliament from Ukraine speaking about the same topic. And she said from the reparations Russia is going to pay when they're defeated in this war. So that was her answer, and I'll just pass that on. And absolutely, you know, you're talking my language about collaborative practices. That's, I think, the only place where this can come from. I'd like to hear more about your experiences working in that area. And, you know, many people could talk on this topic, and I think they should, especially about how you avoid sort of the emergence of, or the kind of toxification of collaborative practices with local authorities through corrupt practices and the breaking down of these relations, or just lip service being paid to these kinds of ideas, when in actual fact, collaboration is far from the reality. So I think that's quite a complicated thing to sum up. And in a sense, what I was trying to get at in my presentation was that I think that some of the most authentic collaborative practices are already taking place by the activist communities who've been working long term in those areas with local communities. And that's, I believe that to be a true representation of what collaboration can look like. So if, well-meaning funders can underpin those things that already exist rather than trying to impose something on top, then perhaps we can avoid that breaking down into corruption and dysfunctionality.
And then let's pass the speakers who joined us on Zoom. Sophie, Iryna. Sophie, if you could comment in the
Yeah. If I may, I will just summarize what was going on, so that we had one participant. Her name is Dr. Oktyabrina Shemyakina, and she is an architect, professor, and she said that she's working on urban development in the Donbas and on such problems as greening areas and so on, and suggested cooperation if somebody is interested in that, in teaching and in research. And then we have two questions, one to Sophie and one to Iryna, and we agree that both Sophie and Iryna, they will reformulate questions and give brief answers. So Sophie, please, you can start.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So I'll reply to the question from Yanni Katsonis. And Yanni was asking how the workers that I'm studying understand their work and what they do in light of the past and the present and the future. And I could actually link that to one of the questions I think I heard on the podium, which is also about how to build on the experience of Donbas workers today for reconstruction. So what is specific about the infrastructure workers, and I think I want to make a distinction because we've been speaking a lot about the coal miners, right, and their legacies, their heritage, and their practices, and their pride, and all that. And so what is specific to the infrastructure workers of the same region, or also other regions, is that they were invisible. When the coal miners, whether in the Soviet period or in Perestroika or later in the early 90s, when they were demonstrating also against the policies of the Ukrainian independent state, the coal miners were very visible. These are invisible workers. They became visible when infrastructure systems collapsed, and this happened in the 1990s, and there was a lot of criticism against the lost public services of the Soviet period, and then of course now and since 2014 in the war. So how do these workers see their occupation? So first of all, in terms of let's say pride, it doesn't seem to be limited to these let's say officially narrated Soviet hero workers of the coal mines and other such professions, that actually there is some kind of Soviet era foundation in terms of first of all of training, that there is a very strong occupational legitimization of their status through high quality training as technicians and engineers. So for instance, they in interviews they will say, well, I have a vyše obrazovание, and even if they are repairing cables and the such, and this is an important glue within the company. It seems, because they're in both companies that I studied, we can see a lot of long-term employment, even in Donbas, where the salaries were quite low, and efforts to loyalize the collective. So the collective idea, the idea of the collective, still seems to prevail in some ways through corporate culture, through everyday work within brigades. They work in whether the power networks or the water. They work in more or less stable brigades where they know each other, they know each other's families, each other's problems, they help each other out, and so they constitute this little element within the larger element of the company. And then finally, also what I was speaking about, and that maybe concerns more the present and the future, is that in both companies, it seems that the war experience, as I was saying, is creating a sort of special expertise that they have, especially those who were trained in 2014 until 22 in the Donbas, a wartime expertise that condenses, in a way, a sense of the importance of their work. What is quite striking is that within the general narrative of energy or utilities workers as heroes, which has a right to be and has been largely depicted at the government level in Ukraine and also by the companies themselves. And of course, they do go out, as I said, into dangerous zones, and they risk their lives because of landmines, for instance, and or shelling, which can also still happen. But they do not themselves usually present themselves as heroes or as being some kind of soldiers of the infrastructure frontline. They insist that what they are doing is their business as usual, but in a new context, which requires new expertise. And then they will actually, in interviews, focus more on that expertise, on how they improvise, how they repair when there are no spare parts, and to try to show what it means day to day to actually be doing this. So I hope that.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you. And then I will pass to Iryna, so if you could comment to some of the questions you heard from the audience and in chat.
Yes, thank you very much. So, Tatiana, for this question about kind of Ukrainian nation building project in the Donbas. So I don't think I'm a very big specialist in this, but I think you are right in the sense that we should not only maybe criticize or reflect about the Ukrainian state elites, but more about horizontal ties and how I think like lack of horizontal ties and exchange between different regions of Ukraine actually hindered kind of some like strong common project of culture and cultural life. And I think it's just in general the question about modernization. So my vision of national history is quite simple here in terms of Anderson, right? So you need just more of modernization and infrastructure and transport and connection on horizontal level between different parts of the country to build a strong common culture. But of course, like talking about everything Ukrainian and Donbas, I think there are like diverse understandings of Ukrainianness, and we should not maybe impose like one single understanding of Ukrainianness. And I think there are so many ways of exercising your identity in a civic sense as well. So I really am rather optimistic about kind of future of Ukrainian identities in Donbas as well as in other regions of Ukraine. So I think like diverse and dialogical understandings of Ukrainianness are like the future.
Thank you. And Steve, if you
just very briefly, yeah. So I mean, it's a big question about what sort of, to put it bluntly, economic future there is for the Donbas. Obviously, not all coal mining. Okay. So it's a big question to wonder, to ask what is the sort of economic future for the Donbas? Obviously, not all coal mining is going to disappear overnight. So that is, the reason for the Donbas is still going to be around, even in a much diminished fashion. And there's certainly going to be the need for rebuilding infrastructure and so on. And in a kind of a tragic but way, there's an opportunity to really rethink. Let's just not rebuild. I'm saying we, but meaning the people of the region and Ukraine, not to simply rebuild what existed in the past, but what is the future for the Donbas? To think about what is a kind of comparative advantage for this region in a post-carbon world, for instance. That's a big question. We're struggling with that in many parts of the world, but again, it's an opportunity in a way to use the rebuilding funds that will come in from somewhere to wrestle with that question. The question of region. I mean, I think a regional sense of regional identity is real in the Donbas, and I think it has changed, as Iryna has pointed out, shifted over time. And I don't think that there is. I realize this is a contested issue for Ukraine going back many years, but I don't think there's necessarily a sense of regional identity and regional pride is necessarily detrimental to the idea of building a common Ukraine, very much as suggested.
Thank you for your question. I mean, I'll try to pick that one. So Donbas is not an area of my expertise, but I've been studying previous post-war, after World War II, and it's a big theme and topic how societies emerge, and they do emerge divided from the war, not only with shared experiences, but also with shared grievances. And I think this is a big challenge that lays ahead, because, and then we talked a lot about communities, and I think that will be a big question of not only how communities include, but also who they exclude in silence. You just can right now, so the big question is who was there and was doing during the war. Have you been, and this already is from the latest events of Ukrainian army and liberation of towns and areas. That is, it's a dividing experience, and that's experience which, from what history can teach us, the only way to go through that is actually to talk through that. Because previous experiences of World War II were largely silenced, but they don't go away. They just linger. They reappear in shapes and places that you have to untangle what they are part of which story. So, and that actually would be, I think, a big challenge. It actually would be like, I'm trying to comparing to your question in a way, going to asking to you. I mean, also those who work with activists, and many people who are in NGOs, because they are in such a position of being endangered, and also in a position of having context to leave and evacuate. So that would be also the question how they now are in position of power, of being outside, and how they could share their power and use that power in enabling people who had or chose to stay in the occupation. And that's actually, I think, that is reassembling communities and our, as a society in general, ability to accommodate not only experience the experience which are dissidents, basically would be probably one of the biggest challenge, but also something that can make us more humane and more caring and more attentive as society moving away from the war. We do hope. Agnes, I pass to you
Yeah, well, maybe on that was the perfect way to conclude, I think, with this hope for kind of rebuilding a Ukraine that will be not only the material aspect, but the community aspect of Ukraine, that will be able to deal with all the complexity that the war is bringing, and that will take years or decades to be digested. I was very sensitive to what you just mentioned, because I'm coming from France and we are still digesting, right? 70 years after the end of the war, the past of collaborationism, and that is a dividing element in the French culture even 70 years after. So I can imagine how for Ukraine it will be something that will take a long time to be rebuilt. So on that, I wanted to thank all our team here. Thank you for being with us today, both online and in reality. Thank you so much to Volodymyr and to Sofia to have been helping us organizing and initiating this project. Thank you to all our speakers for this really inspiring discussion. Thank you to Sarah and Kate for organizing the event today and the exhibition. And I invite you, if you still have time, to go downstairs on the second floor and look at the exhibition and continue to discuss on a more informal setting. So thank you all again, and hope to see you soon for our other Ukraine-related event. Thank you.